Over the past few weeks, something important has happened in global trade, but it hasn't made many headlines. The European Union and India have reached a political agreement on a long-awaited free trade deal, ending negotiations that had been stalled for more than a decade. This comes just months after the EU also finalized a major agreement with Mercosur in South America. On the surface, this looks like trade as usual. But underneath, it tells us a lot about how the global system is adapting to a more transactional US foreign policy. And it raises an important question. How will President Trump respond now that other major economies are moving ahead without Washington? Let's break it down. What was actually agreed? The EU-India free trade deal is a political breakthrough rather than a radical rewrite of global commerce. But it is still significant. Once in force, the agreement will eliminate most tariffs on goods, though on staggered timelines, include quotas and carve-outs for sensitive products, improve supply chain integration between Europe and India. For Europe, the biggest beneficiaries are automotive manufacturers, heavy industry, machinery, and high-end industrial exports. For India, the gains are concentrated in textiles and apparel, footwear, steel, and aluminum. Other labor-intensive manufactured goods. This matters because these Indian sectors have historically struggled to compete in Europe against tariff-free exports from least developed countries like Bangladesh. So did this deal happen now? Timing is everything. EU-India trade talks were revived and fast-tracked in February 2025, shortly after Donald Trump returned to the White House and resumed aggressive tariff rhetoric. Both Brussels and New Delhi concluded that waiting for clarity from Washington was too risky. Diversifying trade relationships had become urgent. The US was no longer a reliable anchor for the global trade system. As a result, the EU softened some of its regulatory and non-trade demands. India scaled back ambitions around labor mobility. Politically sensitive agricultural issues were largely excluded. Investment protection was prioritized to ensure ratification. This was less about ambition and more about speed and certainty. So Cho wins, and who doesn't? The deal is deliberately designed to avoid political backlash. In Europe, tariffs on Indian goods were already relatively low. India does not strongly compete in sensitive sectors like EU agriculture. As a result, resistance from member states is expected to be minimal. In India, the government gains export growth in job-creating industries. Prime Minister Narendra Modi strengthens his domestic economic narrative and buffets his nationalist agenda as the country enters 3 important provincial elections later this year. The deal supports long-term employment goals. That is why the agreement is expected to be ratified smoothly and enter into force shortly after final approval later this year. But what about the subtle geopolitical subtext? Trade isn't the whole story. EU leaders and Prime Minister Modi were explicit. This deal is also about preserving an international system under pressure from both superpowers, the US and China. That said, expectations are realistic. Strategic cooperation will begin cautiously on climate policy, digital regulation, infrastructure connectivity, and supply chain resilience. More ambitious areas, like defense and intelligence cooperation, will develop slowly and pragmatically. A revived EU-India Trade and Technology Council will focus on AI, semiconductors, critical minerals, green technology. And a 5-year strategic and defense agreement is being developed, building on India's strong defense ties with France's expected procurement from Germany's shared maritime and cyber concerns. This is not a NATO-style alignment. It's incremental hedging. Now, the key question. What does Trump do next? This is where the broader picture comes into focus. The EU-India deal, combined with the EU-Mercosur agreement, sends a clear signal. Major economies are no longer waiting for US leadership on trade. Trump now faces a choice. Option 1, escalation. He could respond by doubling down on tariffs, targeting Europe or India selectively, using trade pressure as leverage. But this comes with real constraints. An already weaker dollar raises inflation risks further. Bond markets are already sensitive to fiscal credibility. Markets have shown they react quickly to trade shocks. Option 2, re-enter the deal-making. Game alternatively, Trump could seek a bilateral deal with India, reopen selective negotiations with the EU, use trade agreements to claim wins without market disruption. This approach aligns with Trump's transactional style: deals over institutions, optics over frameworks, speed over comprehensiveness. So what is the most likely outcome? The most probable path is neither extreme. Trump is likely to use tariff threats selectively, signal openness to bilateral deals, avoid actions that provoke market instability. In other words, pressure, but not rupture. What does this tell us about the global system? The takeaway isn't that global trade is collapsing, it's that it's being rewired. Multilateralism is thinning. Bilateral and regional deals are accelerating. Trade is increasingly defensive and strategic. The EU-India deal doesn't replace the US, but it reduces dependence on it. And that, more than anything, is the message being sent to Washington. If you want to understand where trade, geopolitics, and markets are heading next, this is the pattern to watch. It is not about chaos, but the real story is about recalibration.